What if the most powerful king in the Holy Land was also the most afraid man in it? What if the greatest temples, the strongest fortresses, and the most advanced cities of their age were not built to inspire faith, but to hide fear? Why would a ruler who rebuilt the house of God surround it with warning signs of death? Why would a dynasty favored by Rome collapse faster than those who openly defied it? Why do its stones still stand, while its bloodline vanished without mercy? This is not a story about a single man. It is a story about power that mistrusts love, loyalty that can be transferred, and greatness that demands silence. Some kings conquer enemies, others conquer memory. But what happens when a king tries to conquer both? Why did this kingdom leave behind monuments instead of peace? Why did fear outlive faith? And why did the most carefully engineered reign in the ancient world end not with triumph, but with fire, famine, and dust? If you walk the streets of Jerusalem today, you are still standing on his stones. But the question remains, did this king build history? Or did history survive despite him? Imagine the smell of rotting meat, not in a butcher shop, but coming from the gold-draped bed of a king. It's 4 BC, in the suffocating winter heat of Jericho. Herod the Great is dying, but he isn't going quietly. His skin is crawling with parasites. His breath smells like a slaughterhouse, and according to the physicians of the time, his lower body is quite literally being consumed by gangrene, while he is still conscious. But as he gasps for air, he isn't praying for mercy. He's planning a massacre. He knows that the moment his heart stops, the streets of Jerusalem will erupt, not in mourning, but in celebration. And he can't have that. So, he issues a final, chilling command: round up the most noble families in the kingdom, lock them in the hippodrome, and the second I die, kill them all. He wanted to ensure that if Judea wouldn't weep for him, they would at least weep while he was being buried. This is the man history calls the Great. He was the architect of the Holy Land's most stunning monuments, the man who rebuilt the Temple of God, and the monster who tried to murder Christmas before it even began. But how did a desert outsider, a man with no royal blood and 1,000 enemies, become the most powerful man in the East? And why did his dynasty, built on Roman concrete and Jewish blood, eventually collapse into a nightmare of incest, madness, and worms? To understand the rise of the House of Herod, we have to look at the world's most dangerous piece of real estate: Judea. To a pilgrim, it's the Holy Land. To a general, it's a doormat. In the 1st century BC, if you wanted to march an army from Africa to Asia, you had to trample through Judea. It was a buffer zone between clashing titans, the Roman Republic to the west and the Parthian Empire to the east. Being a king here wasn't a privilege. It was a death sentence. The Romans called the position Rex Socius, a client king. Think of it like being a middle manager in a corporation where the CEO is a homicidal warlord in Rome, and the employees are religious fundamentalists who think paying taxes to that CEO is a mortal sin. If you leaned too far toward Rome, your people stoned you. If you leaned too far toward the people, Rome sent a legion to crucify you. This was the impossible tightrope that the House of Herod decided to walk. Herod didn't come from nowhere. He was an Edomite, an outsider. In the racial hierarchy of Jerusalem, he was a half-breed. He would spend his whole life banging on the glass doors of the Jewish aristocracy, demanding to be let in. He learned his trade from his father, Antipater. If history was a high-stakes poker game, Antipater was the player who never looked at his own cards. He only watched the dealer. He realized early that the God of Israel was powerful, but Roman legions were closer. Antipater once told his son, "Principles get you killed, Herod. Adaptability gets you a crown." And boy did they adapt. They served Pompey until he lost, then flipped to Julius Caesar, then to Cassius. They were political chameleons, betting on whichever Roman horse was winning at that exact second. But in 40 BC the floor fell out. The Parthian Empire surged westward, invading Judea. They brought a puppet king, Antigonus, who was a savage. When Antigonus captured the high priest, he didn't just imprison him, he leaned forward and bit the old man's ears off. Why? Because under Jewish law, a priest with a physical blemish could never serve in the temple again. One bite, and the priesthood was over. Herod, then a young governor, was trapped. The walls were closing in. In the dead of night, he staged an escape that belongs in a Hollywood thriller. He loaded his mother, his sister Salome, and his fiancée Mariamne into wagons and fled into the desert. At one point, a wagon flipped. Herod's mother lay crushed and motionless. In a moment of pure, volatile despair, Herod drew his sword and pressed the tip against his own chest. He was ready to end it all right there in the dirt. Only the screams of his servants stopped him. His mother survived, and so did the beast within him. He stashed his family in the mountain fortress of Masada and kept running. He didn't run to a neighbor. He sailed through winter storms to the only place that mattered: Rome. Picture the scene. 40 BC. A dusty, desperate refugee stands before the Roman Senate. He has no army, no money, and no kingdom, but he has the charm of the devil. He stands between the two biggest names in history, Mark Antony and Octavian. Herod paints a picture of a Judea in chaos, a Judea that needs a loyal dog to guard the empire's porch. The Senate was sold. In a unanimous vote, they declared Herod king of the Jews. There was just one problem. It was a title without a territory. Jerusalem was still held by his enemies. Herod walked out of the Senate with a piece of paper, but he would have to buy his kingdom with iron. It took 3 years of bloody warfare. In 37 BC, the Roman legions finally breached Jerusalem's walls. The slaughter was so horrific that Herod actually started bribing the Roman soldiers out of his own pocket to stop the killing. He stood before the Roman commander, screaming, "Are you trying to leave me the king of a desert? I want to rule subjects, not corpses." He paid for his throne twice, once with the blood of his enemies and once with the gold he paid to stop the massacre. He was finally king. But the bloodstains on the palace steps never truly washed away. Herod's biggest test wasn't a battle, it was a conversation. In 31 BC, his patron Mark Antony was crushed at the Battle of Actium by Octavian. Herod was a dead man walking. He had backed the loser. He had sent supplies to Rome's enemy. Instead of fleeing, Herod did something insane. He sailed to the island of Rhodes to meet the victor, Octavian. He walked into the lion's den, took off his crown, and laid it on the table. He didn't grovel. He looked the future emperor in the eye and said, "Caesar, I was Antony's friend. I sent him arms. I sent him grain. I was loyal to him until the very end, because I am a man who stands by his friends. Now, Antony is dead. Ask yourself not whose friend I was, but what kind of friend I am. I am a weapon waiting to be wielded by the strongest hand." It was a masterstroke. Herod marketed his loyalty as a transferable commodity. Octavian, a pragmatist, picked up the crown and placed it back on Herod's head. Herod returned to Jerusalem untouchable. He proved that in the Game of Thrones, you don't win by being the strongest warrior, you win by being the smartest parasite. Now secure, Herod began to build. But he didn't build for beauty, he built for fear and ego. He wanted to prove to Rome that Judea wasn't a dusty backwater. First, he conquered the sea. The Judean coast had no natural harbors. So, Herod imported a technology the East had never seen: hydraulic concrete. He used volcanic ash from Italy that hardened underwater. He built Caesarea Maritima, a city that rose from the waves with a theater, a hippodrome, and a sewer system that flushed with the tides. When a Roman sailor stepped off a ship, he didn't feel like he was in Judea, he felt like he was in a suburb of Naples. But if Caesarea was his handshake with Rome, Masada was his middle finger to the world. Perched on a mountain overlooking the Dead Sea, Masada was a monument to paranoia. Herod was terrified of a Jewish revolt and terrified of Cleopatra. So, he built a panic room in the sky. He carved cisterns that could hold 10 million gallons of rainwater, and even had ice hauled from the mountains, so he could serve cold wine in the 110-degree desert heat. Masada reveals the truth. Herod was a king who could conquer the sea and the desert, but he could never conquer the terror living inside his own chest. Finally, there was the temple. The existing Jewish temple was modest, and for a man with Herod's ego, that was unacceptable. He told the Jewish people, "Let me tear down the house of God so I can build you a better one." The people were terrified. They thought he'd tear it down and leave them spiritually homeless. So, Herod had to stockpile every stone before a single hammer was swung. He trained 1,000 priests as masons so that no unclean hands would touch the holy areas. What rose was an artificial mountain. The stones weighed up to 500 tons. Modern engineers still argue about how they moved them. The facade was covered in gold plates. When the sun rose, the reflection was so blinding that pilgrims had to look away. Even the rabbis who hated Herod had to admit, "He who has not seen Herod's building has not seen a beautiful building in his life." But beneath the gold lay a darker architecture. Herod built the temple like a fortress of exclusion, with signs in Greek and Latin warning that any foreigner who crossed the line would be responsible for their own death. He tried to marry Jewish faith with Roman power, but you can't force two repelling magnets together without creating an explosion. And the explosion was coming. Not from the Romans, and not from the rebels, but from Herod's own bedroom. While the king was building monuments to his greatness, a poison was spreading through his palace. He had 10 wives, but he only loved one, Mariamne. She was a Hasmonean princess, a member of the royal family Herod had essentially replaced. To Herod, she was the ultimate prize. To Mariamne, he was the man who had murdered her grandfather and her brother. Their marriage was a battlefield of lust and resentment. Herod's sister Salome saw this weakness and began to whisper. She planted seeds of doubt, suggesting that Mariamne was unfaithful, that she was plotting to poison him. Herod's love was as violent as his hate. In a fit of jealous rage, fueled by the lies of his own family, he did the unthinkable. He ordered the execution of the only woman he ever truly loved. The moment the blade fell, something in Herod snapped. He began to wander the palace halls at night, calling her name as if she were still there. He fell into a deep, catatonic depression that lasted for months. The great architect had built a kingdom, but he had demolished his own soul. And as the madness took hold, the great Herod began to transform into the monster that would eventually order the slaughter of every male infant in Bethlehem. The golden age of Judea was about to turn red. The madness didn't stop with Mariamne. It was a contagion that infected the very walls of the palace. Herod had killed his wife, but her ghost, and the royal blood she carried, lived on in his 2 sons, Alexander and Aristobulus. These boys were popular, they were handsome, they were educated in Rome, and they were the darlings of the Jewish people because they represented the old, legitimate royal line. To the public, they were the hope for a future without Herod's cruelty. To Herod, they were 2 ticking time bombs. His sister Salome, the same woman who had engineered Mariamne's death, began to whisper again. She told Herod that his sons were not mourning their mother. They were planning to avenge her. She claimed they were mocking Herod behind his back, calling him a clumsy usurper who had only kept his throne because he groveled to Rome. For a man as insecure as Herod, this was the ultimate trigger. He began to see daggers in every shadow. He put his own sons on trial, not once, but twice. Imagine the scene in the court at Berytus. A father, the king, standing before a panel of Roman judges, screaming accusations at his own flesh and blood. The boys defended themselves with eloquence, but the verdict was already written in Herod's paranoia. In 7 BC, he ordered his own sons to be taken to Sebaste and strangled. When the news reached Rome, the Emperor Augustus reportedly shook his head and remarked, "It is better to be Herod's pig than his son." Because as a nominal Jew, Herod wouldn't eat pork, but he had no problem devouring his own children. With the legitimate heirs dead, the palace became a shark tank. His eldest son, Antipater, the one who had helped turn Herod against his brothers, thought he was next in line. But Herod's mind was now a shattered mirror. He discovered that Antipater had been trying to speed up his father's death with a slow-acting poison. The betrayal was the final blow. Herod had Antipater dragged to a dungeon. By now, the king's body was failing as fast as his mind. This brings us back to that stench in Jericho. The Herodian fire, as historians call it. He was burning from the inside out. His lungs were filled with fluid, his limbs were swollen with dropsy, and his internal organs were liquefying. He attempted suicide with a paring knife while trying to peel an apple, but his cousin grabbed his hand. In his final days, he finally gave the order to execute Antipater, his last remaining heir of note. 5 days later, the king of the Jews breathed his last, leaving behind a kingdom that was a masterpiece of stone and a wreckage of human lives. But the death of a tyrant rarely brings peace, it only creates a vacuum. Herod's will divided the kingdom between his 3 surviving sons, Archelaus, Antipas, and Philip. None of them were given the title of king. Rome demoted them to ethnarchs and tetrarchs, essentially glorified governors. They inherited a land that hated them, and a Roman Empire that was losing its patience. Archelaus took Jerusalem and Judea, but he had all of his father's cruelty, and none of his genius. During his very first Passover, he got into a dispute with the crowds and sent the cavalry into the temple courts. 3,000 pilgrims were slaughtered in the shadows of the gold-plated pillars Herod had built for God. The Jews finally did something they had never dared to do under Herod. They sent a delegation to Rome and begged Augustus to remove Archelaus. In 6 AD, Rome listened. They banished Archelaus to Gaul and did something that changed history forever. They placed Judea under direct Roman rule. Now, the taxes didn't go to a local king, they went straight to Caesar. The high priests were now appointed by Roman governors. And into this pressure cooker stepped a man whose name would become synonymous with cowardice. Pontius Pilate. Pilate was not a diplomat. He was a soldier. He arrived in Jerusalem and immediately insulted the population by marching his troops into the city with standards bearing the image of the emperor, an act of pure idolatry in the eyes of the Jews. Thousands of protesters gathered at his residence in Caesarea, lying face down in the dirt for 5 days and nights. When Pilate threatened to slaughter them, they bared their necks and told him they would rather die than see their laws violated. Pilate backed down, but the line was drawn. The Jews realized that if they pushed hard enough, the Romans might blink. The Romans realized that the Jews were ungovernable. While the cities were simmering, a different kind of fire was burning in the Galilee. This was the territory of Herod Antipas, the most cunning of the brothers. He was the man who built the city of Tiberias on top of a graveyard, making it unclean for any devout Jew to enter. Antipas was a man of appetites. He fell in love with his brother's wife Herodias and divorced his own wife to marry her, a scandal that violated every religious law in the book. From the wilderness came a voice of protest, John the Baptist. He didn't care about royal titles. He stood by the Jordan River and called Antipas exactly what he was, an adulterer. For Antipas, John was a nuisance. For Herodias, John was a threat to her status. She waited for her moment, and it came during a drunken birthday banquet. Her daughter Salome danced for the king. In a moment of grand, intoxicated generosity, Antipas promised her anything, up to half his kingdom. Prompted by her mother, the girl didn't ask for gold or land. She asked for the head of John the Baptist on a platter. Antipas was trapped by his own pride and his high-stakes audience. The execution was carried out, and the house of Herod claimed another victim. But killing a prophet only makes his message louder. By the 30s AD, the tension in Judea was at a breaking point. You had the Roman governors squeezing the province for taxes, the Herodian princes living in Greek-style luxury while the peasants starved, and a growing movement of zealots who believed that the only way to purify the land was through the edge of a blade. This is the world that a young prince named Herod Agrippa inherited, Agrippa was the grandson of Herod the Great and the murdered Mariam. He grew up in Rome as a playboy, a best friend to the future Emperor Caligula. He was a man who knew how to work the halls of power better than anyone since his grandfather. Through a series of political miracles and the deaths of his uncles, Agrippa managed to do the impossible. He reunited the kingdom. For a brief moment, it looked like the house of Herod might actually survive. Agrippa was different. He knew he needed the people. He observed the laws, he wept during the reading of the Torah, and he protected the temple. The people loved him. But in 44 AD, at a festival in Caesarea, Agrippa appeared in a robe made entirely of silver. As the sun hit him, the crowd began to shout that he wasn't a man, but a god. Agrippa didn't rebuke them. According to the historian Josephus and the Book of Acts, he was immediately struck with a violent pain in his belly. He was carried out of the theater and died 5 days later, eaten by worms from the inside out, the same gruesome fate as his grandfather. With Agrippa dead, the last bridge between the Jewish people and Rome collapsed. His son, Agrippa II, was too young and too Roman to lead. The governors who followed were increasingly corrupt, treating the province like a lemon to be squeezed until it was dry. In 66 AD, the lemon finally burst. It started over a small dispute about a synagogue in Caesarea, but it turned into a full-scale revolution. The Great Revolt. The Jewish rebels did the unthinkable. They defeated a Roman legion in open battle. They took back Jerusalem. They minted their own coins. They thought the kingdom of God had arrived. But Rome didn't forgive, and Rome didn't forget. They sent their best general, Vespasian, and his son Titus, with 4 legions. This wasn't a police action. It was an annihilation. They systematically broke the Galilee, then moved south toward the heart of the nation. By the year 70 AD, the Holy Land had become a slaughterhouse. The Roman legions, under the command of Titus, had circled Jerusalem like a pack of wolves. Inside the walls, it was even worse. The city wasn't just fighting the Romans, it was fighting itself. 3 different factions of Jewish rebels were locked in a bloody civil war within the city gates. They were so busy murdering each other for control that they actually burned the city's massive grain silos just to keep the other side from having them. Imagine the insanity. The greatest army on earth is sitting outside your door, and you destroy your own food supply. Famine set in almost instantly. People were reduced to chewing on leather belts and searching the sewers for scraps. The historian Josephus records a story so horrific it still chills the blood. A mother, driven mad by hunger, killed and roasted her own infant son. When the rebel leaders smelled the meat and broke into her house to steal it, she showed them the remains. Even the most hardened killers in Jerusalem walked away in silence. The city had lost its mind. Titus didn't want to destroy the city. He wanted the glory of capturing it intact. He sent Josephus to the walls to plead with the rebels to surrender. Josephus stood within earshot of the snipers and screamed, "You are fighting against God. The Romans have the luck of the heavens. Look at your children, they are skeletons. Save the temple before it becomes a tomb." The rebels responded by shooting arrows at him. They believed that at the very last second, God would descend from the clouds and wipe out the Romans. They were waiting for a miracle. What they got was the battering ram. The siege of Jerusalem was a masterclass in Roman engineering and cruelty. They built a circumvallation wall entirely around the city, a 5-mile-long stone fence built in just 3 days, to make sure not a single person could escape. Anyone caught trying to sneak out for food was caught and crucified in full view of the walls. At one point, there were 500 people being crucified every single day, until the Romans literally ran out of wood for the crosses. Then came the breach. The Romans broke through the first wall, then the second. Finally, they reached the heart of the nation, the temple Herod had built with such ego and gold. On the 10th of August, a Roman soldier, acting against Titus's specific orders to spare the building, grabbed a piece of burning wood, and hurled it through a golden window into the inner chambers. The fire spread like a tidal wave. The gold plates on the walls began to melt, pouring liquid fire down the steps. The Roman soldiers, blinded by greed, rushed into the flames to pry the gold out of the cracks in the floor. They butchered everyone in their path, priests, women, children, until the blood ran so thick it actually extinguished some of the fires. By the time the sun went down, the house of God was a smoking skeleton. Titus ordered his men to level the city to the ground. He wanted future generations to look at the spot and wonder if a city had ever stood there at all. The only things left standing were 3 towers of Herod's palace, kept as a grim reminder of how strong the city had been before Rome decided it shouldn't exist anymore. But the war wasn't over. There was one final pocket of resistance, one place Herod had built specifically for a moment like this: Masada. A few hundred Sicarii, the most extreme wing of the rebels, had fled to the mountain fortress. They had Herod's stores of food, his weapons, and his bottomless cisterns of water. They thought they were untouchable. For 2 years, they looked down from their 1,300-foot cliffs and watched the Romans bake in the desert sun. But Rome doesn't do impossible. The 10th Legion, led by Flavius Silva, did something that still looks insane today. Since they couldn't climb the cliffs, they decided to move the earth. They forced thousands of Jewish captives to build a massive dirt ramp, hundreds of feet high, reaching all the way to the top of the fortress. On the night before the final Roman assault, the leader of the rebels, Eleazar ben Yair, gathered his people. He knew the ramp was finished. He knew the sun would bring the Romans, the chains, and the rapes. He stood in the darkness and spoke. Long ago, we resolved to serve neither the Romans nor anyone else but only God. The time has come to prove that resolve. Better to die as free men than to live as slaves. Let our wives die before they are violated, and our children before they taste slavery. They didn't commit mass suicide in a chaotic panic. It was a cold, organized execution. Each man killed his own wife and children. Then, they chose 10 men by lot to kill the rest. Finally, one man killed the other 9, and then drove his sword through his own chest. When the Romans breached the walls the next morning, expecting a massive battle, they were met with a silence that was louder than any war cry. 960 bodies lay in the dust. Only 2 women and 5 children, who had hidden in a cavern, survived to tell the story. The house of Herod, which began with a man running into the desert to save his life, ended with his people dying in the desert to save their dignity. With the fall of Masada, the Judean kingdom was erased. The Jews were scattered across the face of the earth in a great diaspora that would last nearly 2,000 years. But the house of Herod left behind a ghost. Even today, when you walk through the streets of Jerusalem, you are walking on Herod's stones. The Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism, is just a retaining wall for Herod's platform. His fingerprints are everywhere. He was a man who tried to live forever through stone, because he knew he was too monstrous to live forever through love. But there's one more twist to the story. While Herod's sons were failing and his temple was burning, a small group of followers of a Galilean carpenter, the same one Herod's son had helped execute, were quietly spreading a different kind of kingdom. Herod built for the eyes. They built for the heart. Herod used Roman concrete. They used a message of grace. 2,000 years later, the palaces of Herod are ruins for tourists to photograph. But the movement that started in the shadows of his reign changed the world. The story of the House of Herod is the ultimate warning. You can build the tallest towers, you can kill every rival, and you can win the favor of the most powerful empires. But if you build your kingdom on fear, the wind will eventually blow it all away. While the smoke was still clearing from the ruins of Jerusalem, the story of the House of Herod didn't just vanish. It lingered like a ghost in the Roman court. The final chapter of this dynasty isn't written in blood on a battlefield, but in the quiet, tragic fading of a family that had outlived its purpose. We have to look at Herod Agrippa II. He was the great-grandson of the man who started it all, and he was the last of the line to hold any semblance of power. Unlike his grandfather, who was a master of the desert, Agrippa II was a man of the city, specifically the city of Rome. He grew up in the shadow of the emperors, more comfortable in a toga than in the robes of a Jewish priest. When the Great Revolt broke out, he didn't stand with his people. He stood on a balcony in Jerusalem and begged the crowd to submit to Rome. They responded by pelting him with stones. He spent the rest of the war as a guest in the Roman camp, watching from a safe distance as his country was dismantled stone by stone. He was a king without a kingdom, a man whose only job was to be a Jewish expert for the Romans. He is most famous in history for a single conversation, a moment where he crossed paths with a prisoner named Paul of Tarsus. Agrippa II sat in his golden chair, listening to this tentmaker talk about a resurrected king from Nazareth. He famously remarked, "In a short time would you persuade me to be a Christian?" He wasn't being moved by faith, he was being sarcastic. He was a man of the old world, a man who believed in power you could touch, gold you could weigh, and walls you could build. He couldn't see that the world was shifting beneath his feet. When Agrippa II died childless in 100 AD, the house of Herod officially went extinct. The devil's architects were gone. Their lands were absorbed into the Roman province of Syria, and the name Herod became a curse word in the mouths of both Jews and Christians. But why does this matter to us today? Why do we still care about a family of paranoid tyrants from 2,000 years ago? It's because the House of Herod is the ultimate case study in the architecture of power. Think about the sheer scale of what they left behind. When you look at the landscape of the Middle East, you are looking at Herod's vision. He was the first man to truly bridge the gap between East and West. He brought the sophistication of the Roman world, their theatres, their plumbing, their massive engineering, and grafted it onto the most ancient, stubborn corner of the earth. He showed that you could control a population, not just with soldiers, but with awe. He built things so big that people felt small. He built things so beautiful that people felt that surely God must be on his side. It was the first true PR campaign in history written in stone. But there is a dark irony in the ruins. If you go to the site of the Herodium today, the massive palace fortress where Herod was buried, you'll find it's a hollowed-out mountain. He literally had his slaves move a hill to make it taller, just so his tomb would be visible from Jerusalem. He wanted to be the biggest thing on the horizon, even in death. Yet when the rebels took over during the war, the first thing they did was smash his sarcophagus to pieces. They didn't want his gold. They wanted his memory gone. They realized that Herod's greatness was a lie. It was a shell. He had built a house that looked like a fortress, but felt like a prison. The legacy of the Herods is a mirror for every empire that has followed. It tells us that technology and infrastructure are not the same thing as stability. You can have the fastest ships in the harbor and the most gold in the bank. But if the people inside the walls feel like they have nothing to lose, the walls will eventually come down. The Romans thought they had solved the Jewish problem by destroying the temple and erasing the Herods. They even renamed the province Palestine to try and wipe the Jewish identity off the map. But they were wrong. The physical temple was gone, but the ideas that had survived Herod's purges, the ideas of justice, of a single God, of a kingdom not made with hands, those ideas traveled with the refugees into the corners of the Roman Empire. Herod's stones stayed in Judea and turned to dust. The message of the people he tried to suppress turned into the foundation of Western civilization. As we look back at the 1-hour journey of this dynasty, from the first bribe Antipater gave to a Roman general to the final, lonely death of Agrippa II, we see a recurring theme: the high stakes of the human ego. Herod the Great was a man who had everything: the favor of Caesar, the most beautiful wife in the world, and a treasury that was never empty. And yet, he died in agony, screaming for the deaths of his own family, convinced that everyone hated him. And the tragedy is, he was right. He had traded love for fear, and in the end, fear was the only thing he had left. So, when you see the images of the Western Wall or the heights of Masada, don't just see the greatness. See the cost. See the thousands of workers who died in the heat to move those stones. See the families torn apart by a king's paranoia. And remember that the greatest kingdoms aren't the ones that leave behind the biggest ruins. They are the ones that leave behind a better world. The house of Herod was a flash of lightning in the desert. It was bright, it was terrifying, and it was gone in a second. But in that brief flash, it revealed the true nature of power. It showed us that you can build a kingdom that lasts for a century. But if it's built on blood, it's only a matter of time before the desert takes it back. To truly understand how Herod held on to power for 37 years in a land that wanted him dead, we have to look at the invisible architecture of his kingdom, his secret police. Herod didn't just build walls of stone. He built walls of ears. He was one of the first rulers to implement a massive, state-funded domestic spy network. It's said that he would frequently dress as a commoner and wander the markets of Jerusalem at night, leaning into conversations to hear what the merchants really thought of him. If you were caught whispering against the king, you didn't just get a fine. You vanished. He built a series of fortresses like the Hyrcania and the Machaerus, not to defend against foreign invaders, but to serve as black sites for political prisoners. If you were a member of the old Hasmonean aristocracy and you were seen as a threat, you were sent to the desert. You didn't come back. This environment of total surveillance created a society where everyone was a performer. Every smile in the palace was a mask, and every compliment to the king was a survival tactic. This is why the high-stakes dialogue of the Herodian court is so fascinating. No one ever said what they actually meant. A dinner party at Herod's palace was more dangerous than a battlefield, because a misplaced word over a cup of wine could lead to your entire family being wiped out by mourning. Then there was the economy of ego. How did a small province like Judea afford the greatest building program in the history of the Roman East? The answer is a brutal combination of visionary trade and crushing taxation. Herod realized that he sat on a gold mine, the Dead Sea. In ancient times, the asphalt and bitumen from the Dead Sea were essential for shipbuilding and medicine. Herod seized the entire industry. He also controlled the trade routes for frankincense and myrrh coming up from Arabia. He was a merchant king who used his profits to buy the loyalty of Rome. But for the average Judean farmer, the golden age of Herod felt a lot like slavery. To pay for the gold plates on the temple and the marble theatres in Caesarea, the peasantry was squeezed to the breaking point. This created a massive class divide. On one side you had the Herodians, the wealthy, Greek-speaking elites who loved the new theatres and the Roman lifestyle. On the other side, you had the rural poor, who saw this progress as an insult to their god and a theft of their livelihood. This economic tension is the hidden engine behind the religious revolts. When we see the zealots fighting in the streets years later, they weren't just fighting for theology, they were fighting against a system that had turned them into beggars in their own land. We also have to talk about the shadow of the Nabateans. To the east of Herod's kingdom lay the Nabatean Empire, the masters of Petra. This was a constant, high-stakes rivalry. Herod's mother was a Nabatean princess, yet he spent much of his reign in border skirmishes with them. This was a desert cold war. Both sides were competing for the same trade routes, and both were trying to prove to Rome that they were the more civilized partner. Herod's obsession with building Masada and other desert fortresses wasn't just about his own people. It was about showing the Nabateans that he could project power into the harshest environments on Earth. He was marking his territory in a way that couldn't be ignored. Now, let's go deeper into the Temple of Tension. We often think of the temple as a place of peace, but under Herod, it was a fortress within a city. To keep the priests in check, Herod took control of the high priest's vestments, the sacred robes. He locked them in the Antonia fortress, a Roman-style garrison he built overlooking the temple courts. If the priests didn't cooperate with Herod, they didn't get their robes. And if they didn't have their robes, They couldn't perform the sacrifices. It was a hostage situation. He held their religion captive to ensure his political safety. This created a spiritual vacuum. Many of the most devout Jews felt that the temple had been polluted by Herod's touch. They fled into the desert, to places like Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. They were waiting for a teacher of righteousness to lead them, because they felt their king was a wolf in sheep's clothing. This is why the wilderness became the breeding ground for new movements. When John the Baptist and later Jesus of Nazareth appeared, they weren't just religious figures. They were walking into a society that was already at its boiling point because of the house of Herod's corruption. Even the way Herod died has a hidden layer of political drama. As he lay dying in Jericho, his sister Salome and his wife Malthace were literally fighting over his signet ring while he was still breathing. They knew that whoever held the ring held the power to forge a new will. The high stakes didn't end with the king's pulse. They accelerated. The moment he died, his son Archelaus had to rush to Rome to defend the throne, while his other brothers, Antipas and Philip, were right behind him, whispering in the emperor's ear to betray their own brother. It was a family of vipers where the only loyalty was to the crown. This brings us to the Roman perspective. To a man like Augustus or Tiberius, the house of Herod was a necessary evil. They viewed the Jews as a difficult people, deeply religious, prone to riot, and obsessed with laws the Romans didn't understand. The Herods served as a buffer. They were the ones who had to do the dirty work of tax collection and riot control, so the Roman legions didn't have to. But the moment a Herod became more of a liability than an asset, like Archelaus or later Antipas, Rome would discard them without a second thought. The client king was the most precarious job in the world. You had to be strong enough to keep your people down, but weak enough to never threaten Rome. It was a balance that required a genius level of manipulation, and once Herod the Great was gone, that genius was replaced by petty greed. To expand these final themes into a 3,000-word deep dive, we need to move beyond just what happened and explore the psychological and cultural warfare of the era. We will analyze the specific clashes between Hellenism and Judaism, the hidden engineering secrets of the stones, and the philosophical collapse of the dynasty. Here is the expanded, high-density text for the final section. To truly grasp the magnitude of the House of Herod, we have to look past the blood and the gold and examine the cultural collision that Herod forced upon the ancient world. This wasn't just a king ruling a territory, it was a man trying to merge two incompatible universes. On one side, you had the Greco-Roman world, a world of theatres, naked athletics, pagan philosophy, and the worship of human achievement. On the other side, you had the Jewish world, a world of strict monotheism, ancestral purity, and a deep-seated belief that no man, no matter how powerful, could ever sit in the place of God. Herod was trying to be the bridge between these two worlds, but in doing so, he became a man with no home. He was a citizen of the world, ruling a people who were proudly anti-world. He spent millions of dollars sponsoring the Olympic Games in Greece during a year they were facing financial ruin. Why? Because he wanted his name carved into the marble of the stadiums in Europe. He wanted the Greeks to see him as a sophisticated philosopher king, a patron of the arts, and a man of enlightened culture. He wanted the Roman Senate to view him as their most loyal and civilized general in the East. He was obsessed with his international brand. But back in the narrow, dusty streets of Jerusalem, this globalist ambition felt like a slap in the face. To the devout Jew, the gymnasiums Herod built weren't symbols of progress. They were houses of sin. The theatres weren't for entertainment. They were places where the sacred laws were mocked. When Herod placed a massive golden eagle, the symbol of Roman power, over the gate of the Holy Temple, it wasn't seen as a decorative gift. It was seen as an idol, a desecration of the most holy place on earth. This created a psychic fracture in the soul of the nation. It was a cultural war that simmered for decades before it ever turned into a military one. Herod had built a magnificent stage, but he had forgotten one crucial detail. The actors he had hired, the Jewish population, absolutely hated the play. They didn't want to be part of a global empire. They wanted to be a holy people. Herod's tragedy was that he built a kingdom for everyone except his own subjects. He was a king who ruled over millions of bodies, but never held a single heart. If we look at the engineering of his reign, we see this same ego reflected in the very geology of the land. Take the Herodian stones at the base of the Temple Mount. These aren't just blocks of rock. They are statements of defiance against nature itself. Some of these stones weigh over 500 tons. To put that in perspective, that is heavier than a fully loaded Boeing 747. There are no cranes in the ancient world that should have been able to lift them. Yet, they sit there today, fitted together with such terrifying precision that you cannot even slide a razor blade or a piece of paper between the joints. Why go to such impossible lengths? Because Herod wasn't just building a temple. He was trying to solve the problem of God with the solution of concrete. He wanted to build something so massive, so heavy, and so permanent that even the heavens would have to acknowledge his greatness. He was attempting to use architecture as a form of immortality. He knew his family line was fragile. He knew his people hated him. He knew his Roman masters were fickle. So, he put his trust in the only thing he thought couldn't be killed: stone. But as the final Herod, Agrippa II, found out, stone has a limit. By the time Agrippa II reached the end of his life, the great experiment of the Herodian bridge had collapsed. He sat in his palace in Rome, a guest of the empire, while the smoke from his burning capital still drifted across the Mediterranean. He left behind no heirs, no legacy of peace, and a country that had been literally erased from the map. He died as a footnote in a Roman ledger, a man who had traded his soul for a title that no longer meant anything. This brings us to the ultimate pattern interrupt in the history of power. We are taught that the people with the most gold and the biggest walls win. But the house of Herod proves the opposite. While Herod was building Masada, a small group of people in the same desert were writing scrolls. While Herod's son was executing prophets to please a dancing girl, the message of those prophets was taking root in the hearts of the poor. Herod's greatness was a hollow shell. He had all the external markers of success: the friendship of emperors, the most beautiful palaces in the East, and a military that could crush any rebellion. Yet, his life ended in a scream of agony, surrounded by a family that was already planning how to divide his corpse. He is the ultimate warning for any leader or any empire that believes infrastructure is the same thing as stability. You can pave the roads, you can build the airports, and you can secure the borders. But if you do not have a moral foundation, if you do not respect the soul of the nation, you are just building a very expensive sandcastle before an incoming tide. The irony of history is that the king of the Jews who built the most beautiful building in the world is now remembered primarily as a villain in a story he tried to delete. He tried to kill the future in a manger in Bethlehem, and in doing so, he ensured his own infamy. He tried to marry the Jewish faith to Roman power, but you cannot force two repelling magnets together without causing an explosion. Today, when tourists walk through the ruins of Caesarea or stand in the shadow of the Western Wall, they often feel a sense of wonder. They see the scale, the marble, and the vision. But if you listen closely to the stones, they tell a different story. They tell a story of a man who was so terrified of being forgotten that he turned his entire kingdom into a monument to his own anxiety. They tell a story of a family that had everything and understood nothing. The house of Herod was a flash of lightning in the desert, bright, terrifying, and gone in an instant. It showed us that power without purpose is just a slow-motion tragedy. In the end, the gold plates were melted down, the marble theatres were buried in sand, and the royal line was cut off. What survived wasn't the concrete. It was the word. It was the faith of the people who refused to be Romanized. It was the spirit of the rebels who preferred death to slavery. As we close this chapter on the most volatile dynasty in history, we have to realize that we are still living in Herod's world. We still see leaders who try to build their way out of insecurity, we still see cultures clashing between the global and the local. The House of Herod is not just ancient history. It is a mirror. It asks us, what are you building? Are you building something that serves the people, or are you building a monument to yourself? Because the desert is very patient, and it eventually takes everything back. Except for the truth. The story of the kings of Judea ends not with a crown, but with a question. Herod had the stones, but his enemies had the stories, and 2,000 years later, we are still telling the stories, while we are still digging up the stones. It is the final victory of the spirit over the sword. The devil's architects are long gone, but the foundations they laid, both the physical ones in the dirt and the psychological ones in our history, remain as a testament to the fact that you can conquer a land, but you can never truly conquer a soul that belongs to something higher than a king. To truly close the loop on this hour-long epic, we have to look at the biological shadow of Herod. While the royal line officially ended with Agrippa II, the Herodian Dina of governance lived on. The Roman Empire took Herod's model of the client state and exported it to every corner of the globe. Every time you see a modern government that acts as a proxy for a superpower, every time you see a leader who is more loyal to an international alliance than to their own voters, you are seeing a ghost of Herod. He was the pioneer of the global elite. He was the first ruler to realize that if you could please the center of the world, you could get away with almost anything in the periphery. This created a template for tyranny that lasted for centuries. But there is a final, hidden irony. When the Romans destroyed the temple in 70 AD, they took the treasures, the golden menorah, the sacred vessels, back to Rome. They used that stolen gold to fund the construction of the Colosseum. Think about that. The most famous symbol of Roman entertainment, where Christians and rebels were later thrown to the lions, was built with the blood money of Herod's fallen kingdom. The stones of Jerusalem literally paid for the stadiums of Rome. It is a cycle of power and pain that never truly ends. But as we look at the ruins of the Colosseum and the ruins of Herod's temple today, we see that they are both equally empty. They are both monuments to a version of greatness that eventually eats itself. The House of Herod was a masterpiece of human will, but it was a failure of human wisdom. And so, we leave the House of Herod where we found it, in the dust, a family that reached for the stars and ended up under the earth. A dynasty that built for eternity and barely lasted a century. Their story is a pattern interrupt in the grand narrative of humanity. A reminder that the things we build with our hands will always fall, but the things we build in our hearts are the only things that truly last.